I'm Mark Whitaker, an analyst here at the Legislative Analyst Office, and in this webcast I'll be discussing our new report on the plan to sell and then lease back some of the state's office buildings. Legislation passed last year allows the State Department of General Services to sell 11 state office properties and then lease them back from the new owners. Selling the buildings would allow the state to get some revenue for the general fund to help bridge the state's current budget gap. The state would then lease the buildings back from the new owner, allowing the state to continue occupying the buildings. This would be a new type of transaction for the state that raises a number of questions, the most significant being, is this a good deal for the state of California? In the report, we attempt to answer this question by estimating the fiscal impact of the sale-leaseback. On the one hand, a benefit of the sale-leaseback is that the state would receive a significant amount of one-time revenue from the sale of the buildings. The state still has outstanding bonds on some of the buildings, so the sale proceeds would first go towards paying off these bonds, but the remainder would be deposited in the general fund to help with balancing the budget. The governor had estimated the general fund benefit would be approximately $600 million. In the report, we find that the governor's estimate of $600 million represents the low end of what the state could expect to achieve. Since our report went to publication, this has been confirmed as the administration announced initial bids exceeded the governor's estimate of $600 million. Recognizing the governor's estimate represented the minimum the state should expect to receive from the sale, our report also looks at a more optimistic scenario in which the one-time revenue could be as high as $1.4 billion. This may be surprising since this is commonly thought to be a low point in the market for selling property. But the nature of the sale-leaseback transaction may actually make the state's buildings very attractive to investors because the guaranteed occupancy offered by the state's lease of 20 years would distinguish its properties from others that are currently experiencing high vacancy rates. Ultimately, the one-time revenue the state receives will depend upon the bidding climate, but we think it could be as high as $1.4 billion. In addition to the revenue, however, the state will also be agreeing to at least 20 years of lease payments in order to stay in the buildings. The proposed lease would have an initial term of 20 years with options to extend at 5-year intervals up to a total of 50 years. As shown here in the figure, we forecast the lease costs under the sale-leaseback would cost the state more money each year than it would to own the buildings. We estimate that in the first year, leasing the buildings would cost about $30 million more than owning, while in later years, the leasing costs could exceed ownership costs by more than $200 million annually. The main reason for this difference is that the state's ownership costs would decrease over time as we pay off the bonds, but the rental costs would continue to increase since the proposed leases include provisions for increasing the rent every 5 years. Cumulatively, leasing would cost the state approximately $5 billion more than owning over the 35-year period. The key question for the legislature to consider is whether the one-time revenue the state would receive from the sale is enough to compensate for the increased leasing costs in the long run. We found that after accounting for the future costs and converting them into today's dollars, the additional cost of leasing the buildings over 35 years was more than the one-time revenue the state would receive. Even at our optimistic scenario of $1.4 billion in one-time revenue, we estimate that the sale-leaseback would cost the state approximately $600 million more in present value terms than maintaining ownership of the buildings. Based upon this analysis, we would not normally advocate the sale-leaseback as good budgeting practice, since it would effectively add to the structural deficit in order to cover current operating expenses. However, we also recognize that in the current budget environment, the sale-leaseback represents one imperfect option among many that the legislature will need to consider in balancing the budget, and ultimately the legislature will need to decide how the costs of the sale-leaseback compare to the other options under consideration. But given the additional costs of the sale-leaseback in the range of $600 million to $1 billion, we would recommend the legislature strongly consider other alternatives prior to pursuing the sale-leaseback. And in conclusion, all of this information, as well as other factors we considered and the various assumptions we used for our forecast, are included in the written report evaluating the sale-leaseback proposal should the state sell its office buildings, which is available on our website. Thank you for your time.